Hey gang, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is another edition of The Radical Reset. Well, the world just gets weirder and weirder. And now in Seattle, Washington, they have roped off an entire part of the city. They're calling it CHAZ, which is, I think, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, C-H-A-Z, although when I first heard it, I thought it was the name of Cher and Sonny Bono's transgender child. But I digress. That was just a silly joke. Please don't write me letters about that. Anyway, having said that, I have no idea where that's ending, and I have no idea where this violence is ending, and I have no idea when the riots are ending, and I have no idea when the protests are ending, and neither do you, and neither does anybody else, and we can opine and go on and on and on. But I wonder. This whole thing made me wonder back to 1968. And in 1968, Richard Nixon was running for president against Hubert Humphrey and George Wallace. For those of you who don't remember George Wallace, he was the governor of Alabama, and he led the most successful third-party movement since Teddy Roosevelt and the Bull Moose Party at the turn of the century. And he was an what's what I'm looking for? An unapologetic, by this point in 1968, he was sort of becoming semi-apologetic about being a racist, but he had famously issued the quote, and pardon me for using this word, we're all grown-ups here, I'm just going to say it. When he lost his first gubernatorial race in Alabama and he was beaten by a bigger racist than even he was, his retort to that was, "I will never be out-niggered again." Now, that was George Wallace. He was shot by a guy named Arthur Bremer in the parking lot of the Laurel Shopping Center in Laurel, Maryland, and blah, blah, blah. But at the time that Nixon was running, the whole point I'm bringing this up is he was running as the law and order candidate for president. And we're in a very similar, history doesn't repeat itself, but the situations kind of mirror each other. And we're in a very similar situation. In 1968, the streets were full of protests, mostly over the Vietnam War and civil rights. There, in the civil rights movement area, which is pertinent to today, there were the people who followed the teachings of the, by then, already assassinated, but great Martin Luther King, one of my personal heroes, which were nonviolent, and the followers of, for example, the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther movements, which were in favor of violent protests. And kind of like the 1968 version of Antifa, but for black people only. I don't know. I'm not quite sure of the parallels. But anyway, it was very violent. The streets were very violent. And Hubert Humphrey was the vice president under Lyndon Johnson, and Johnson had chosen not to run, and Humphrey was running. And both Nixon and Humphrey were running, but Nixon ran on something called the silent majority. He said there was a silent majority of people out there in America at the time who believed in law and order and wanted someone to step in and do it. And Nixon was elected largely because of for this reason. Despite all the protests, and I was alive and well, and in 1968 I was 11 years old, and I was a very aware 11-year-old. And I'm telling you for a fact, I can tell you this firsthand, the vast majority of people were not involved in the protests and were not involved in the riots. Just like today, the vast majority of people are not involved in the protests and are not involved in the riots that are going on. And yet we all have to live with, the consequences. That was that banging in the background. When you do these home YouTube channel things, you never know when they're going to dump the dumpster. That was what that sound was. Anyway, I digress. Back to the story. Anyway, Richard Nixon was elected. Now today, President Trump, you can see it coming a mile away. He is structuring himself to run a second Nixon run. He is starting to sound like a cross between Richard Nixon and George Wallace as he throws out if you want to call it, I don't know if Trump has ideas, his reactions to what's going on, and his strategy is going to be to run on law and order. A blind man could see it. He's going to run on law and order and hate China. Okay, that's what it's going to come down to. And then Biden is going to have to try to find a way to out law and order and out hate China him. And I think he's going to be, I realize that the polls now are showing Trump way, way behind, but if I were a betting man and I were playing the futures markets today, and I would bet on Trump being reelected. Now, having said that, it's precarious because when Nixon was running, he had nothing to do with the unrest that was in the streets, and Trump is the president currently, so the case could be made that he has something to do with the unrest in the streets, although personally I don't buy that. But anyway, the point of this entire podcast is I'm wondering This is not so much my opinion as just me asking. Do you agree with me that, by the way, before I even get into the question I'm about to ask, here's what brought it to mind, and here's what made me decide to do this podcast. I made the statement, and I'm not the only one who's made it, on my Facebook, and I go into various groups on Facebook, libertarian groups, and even socialist groups, and I opine and go back and forth and argue and blah, 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 because I don't know, because I'm a glutton for punishment, but I'm also trying to promote the YouTube channel and the podcast and, my books and so on and so forth. And anyway, having said all that, I said that of course Black Lives Matter, but of course all lives matter. And then I got the predictable shouting down by the trolls of, you racist fuck, how dare you talk about, all lives matter when it's black. I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what it comes down to. And the lectures on white privilege, but I think that there is a black silent majority. I don't know that this is a fact, but my gut, my instinct, my common sense, I don't know that you can poll this, but I believe there is a majority of black people in America out there today that are not so crazy about the idea of defunding police. I believe there's a majority of black people in America today that know something is fundamentally wrong in the black community itself, that agree with me that single parenthood is an enormous problem, particularly within the black community and all communities of all racial groups, as I am quick to point out, but worst of all in the black community, and largely caused by the government subsidizing. And by the way, I also got a lot of shit for my last podcast, where in the title I basically slut shamed, okay? And I don't know where along the way in America it became bad to call an apple and an orange an orange. But, a person, male or female, that participates in unprotected, unrestricted sex is a slut. Now, we can call them sexually challenged, and we can call them, irresponsible. We can call them whatever you want to be politically correct, but the fact of the matter is, and I use slut generically, male or female. I mean, there was a period in my life, pardon me, what happens is, and I don't know if you notice this, but occasionally I have these little burpy moments while I'm talking. Let me just share with you. I talk so fast and I breathe so rapidly while I'm talking that occasionally I swallow air, and that's what's going on. I don't know what to tell you except that that's how I've done it, and I hope it doesn't bother you that I occasionally do that. I'm going to try to slow down. But anyway, where was I? So, calling something what it is, I guess we just live in a time where I'm not allowed to do that. So I'm going to apologize for using the word slut. I should have used unrestricted sexual practices without protection or birth control. It just seems so easy to say slut. It just says it all. And I don't mean it to me. I mean, I'm telling you, there was a period in my life where I was a man slut. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. Although happily, I never fathered a child. And if I had, I would have taken responsibility for that child. But anyway, I digress. Back to the subject matter at hand. I believe there is a black silent majority. And I hope I'm speaking to some of you now. Because if we defund police, what does defunding police really mean? When these people talk about defunding, they're not talking about anarchy. They're not talking about let's get rid of police with nothing. They're talking about defunding the police departments as they exist today and replacing them with something new. And I've been racking my brain over what something new could be. For example, could we go to the British model where police are unarmed? When I say unarmed, they are armed. They have tasers and they have billy clubs and so on and so forth. I think they're the retractable billy clubs, and I only know that from watching British TV shows. I really, honest to God, don't know if they're carrying retractable clubs or regular clubs like our police carry. But anyways, that's completely unimportant, and why I bring it up is beyond my understanding. But having said that, the way the British do it, as I surmise, is that they have on the street all the police, including the detectives, who go around with tasers and the billy clubs, in one form or another, but they don't carry guns. And when guns are called for, where there's a shooting situation, they call in the British version of SWAT. Now, that seemed very logical to me until I realized that the British population largely is not armed, so they run into guns fairly rarely, I believe, in British law enforcement, where here in the United States, where there are 300 million guns in circulation, the criminals almost always have guns, so disarming the cops to where they don't carry guns and they're only carrying tasers is basically, in my view, putting them into a shooting gallery. So what would we replace the police with when we defund them? And again, I want to preface, I believe that today's police in the United States would become tomorrow's Gestapo if the fascists took over. I am not the mindset, and unlike most of the podcasts you're watching, virtually probably all of them, I might be the only one that actually went to prison. Speaking in this vein, and the story of that, by the way, is in the preface of A Radical Reset, which you can pick up for free on Amazon, or for a low, if you'd rather have a printed copy, for a low charge. Having said that, when you're immersed in that environment, you learn right away the kind of people that become police are the kind of people, by and large, that enjoy authority. Okay, they enjoy being able to reign and rule and push around other people, largely, and because they're sure not doing it for the money. And there are very few that are like that show Blue Bloods on TV, where everybody sits around and they're police because they're altruistic and it's the family business. The majority of police that I ran into firsthand were, by and large, assholes. Kind of superior paramilitary police assholes, and they go out of their way to be assholes, and they assume that everybody, and part of that, to be fair to them, is that they're dealing with, basically the shitter of society. I mean, when you're a police officer, you're dealing with the people that I was in prison with. And I'm going to tell you something. When I was in prison, there were three kinds of people. 98% of the prison population. There were 2% that were like me, that were there for one reason or another and would never go again. It was a one and done. But 98% were recidivists, and 98% were in there for drug-related reasons. Whether it was violent crime or not, it was all somehow connected to gangs, cartels, violence, and crime by and large, or the abuse of drugs and going off on a bender one way or another. And basically, they were the pig scum. And I know, here I go using terms again. Okay, so this is a generic term. They were just scum. Okay, and they break down into three basic groups. Okay, and I called it the STDs: sociopaths, transients, and derelicts. Okay, and when you deal with sociopaths, transients, and derelicts, sociopaths who lie to you like they breathe, transients and derelicts, the only difference between a transient and a derelict is a transient still has a pipe dream, at least that they voice, that they're going to turn their lives around, where derelicts have thrown in the towel and accept who they are. The majority of people I met in prison were derelicts, people that, for them, prison was a lifestyle. They were doing a life sentence on the installment plan. They'd come in and out of prison on a regular basis. And so this is who the police deal with day to day. And of course, it's going to coarsen them. It's a two-way street. This is a complicated issue. And we have to go to the issue of trade-offs versus solutions, because as I've spoken with you before, there are no solutions. There is no perfect fix, okay? There are only trade-offs. So if we defund the police, the trade-off is, what are we going to replace it with? Is it going to be better than what we had? If we are not anarchists, and we're not going to go up the Chaz in Seattle, and we're not going to take over Capitol Hill, and I don't know what they're going to do about that in Seattle. That is just a clusterfuck if there ever was one. But assuming that we're all, the rest of us, reasonable, and we're a member of the silent majority, the black silent majority and the white silent majority, if you're talking about defunding police, and this is where I think the silent majorities are not in favor of it, because they ask the logical question, what's the trade-off? What are we going to get instead of what we already have? What we have is bad, but changing doesn't always make it better. It can make it worse, which is why I had the 7-step plan. I was 2 podcasts ago where I spell out community involvement and training and privatization of the police force. I think the trade-off in privatization is much less than the trade-off in defunding. In other words, if we trade off to privatization, the risk that we're running in doing that is that we're delegating control of policing to a private corporation, and that has a negative connotation given the fact that Hollywood has put out one movie after another, starting with Judge Dredd and going on from there, about a future of dark corporate police forces. What's the other one? RoboCop is another one of those kind of movies where they take over and run roughshod on the citizenry. But the fact of the matter is, corporation is just a word for a lot of people getting together and starting a business, and I don't think it's a very big risk. And everything private is done better than everything public, okay? There is no example. You cannot write and make a comment, and if you can, put it underneath. Comment below. Can you think of a single government-run entity that does what it does better than a private alternative does or would? Can you think of one exception to that? I can't. I can't think of a single publicly run anything that's publicly run better than private. So to me, the solution would be in the 7 steps that I named 2 podcasts ago. One of the steps being privatizing the police force. Another one of the steps, making it mandatory that a minimum of 5 hours a week the police participate in community action within the communities, and that we do much more stringent psychological testings, which a private company would do better. Because private company, here's there are a number of reasons, my friends of the silent majority, and that's who I'm speaking to here. Why private is better, but one of the big reasons is it doesn't have to go through politics or committees to make a change. In other words, if in a private police force they found out that a technique they were using was not working properly, they would change it that day. They would, it would be run up the flag, the totem pole to the executive committee, the board of directors. They'd make a decision to change it, and it's changed. As simple as that. No votes, no politics, no press, no nothing. Where in the public sphere, it becomes an entire, long haul of committees and debates and watering it down and special interests and so on and so forth. So for that alone, the alacrity of the private versus the public, I think we gain more than we lose in the trade-off. Plus, it'll be much less expensive. A private police force will be much more efficient. We'll use state-of-the-art. For example, walk into any police station you want around the country and take a look at the computers they're using and the software that they're using, and you're going to vomit in most cases because it's from the year one, basically. But a private concern would be state-of-the-art. And by the way, in case you're wondering, and you're going to go down the rat hole and comment below on private prisons, I was in both public and private prison. And I'm telling you, private prison was 1,000% better. I mean, the people that criticize private prison are people that hate the idea of people making a profit from incarceration. And I'm not that thrilled about it either, having been incarcerated. But having said that, as an inmate, you were much better off. The programs were better, the medical care was better, the food was better, the housing was better. The staff was better. Everything about the private prison was better. I went to the state prison in Yuma, Arizona. It was an absolute shithole run by small-minded shitheads. And I went to the private prison run by a company called Geo in Kingman, Arizona. And I'm not telling you it was paradise by a long shot. And previous to me, Geo had taken over subsequent to a major riot that had taken place in the Kingman prison. But when I went there, it was like going on vacation compared to where I was. So I'm just telling you that from the standpoint of an inmate, and I realize there are shows on TV, and remember, reality TV isn't reality, guys. It's not reality. They're setting up a script. They're setting up a storyline. They're going to find the most extreme views. It's like if you went into one of the websites I go into, you can find anarchists who are nutcases and anti-vaxxers, but you can also ignore them. You don't have to think that they're representative of that group. It's just one nutcase within the group. Well, you can make a lot of cases and you can make a lot of hysterical claims, and you can find an inmate. Inmates are perpetual victims, and they sit there in prison and, they all think that they don't belong there, and not because they didn't do it. They all acknowledge that they did it, but they don't acknowledge their culpability in it. They're victims. They're victims of, and it's across every race. So I'm not going to say, frankly, I never heard a black inmate tell me I'm a victim of racism. It just wasn't a discussion I ever had in prison, and most of my friends in prison were black. So I don't know. And by the way, that's just a funny story as an aside. Obviously, I'm white, and I rolled white in prison, but most of my friends were black because the white guys didn't accept me because I was a Jew, and they were dominated by the skinheads, and the skinheads aren't too crazy about Jews. So I tended to gravitate towards the black guys who didn't give a shit if I had pink polka dots, and I felt exactly the same way. We were friends. But in our conversations, we had very frank conversations, about a lot of different things. But black victimhood really wasn't one of them. But to be fair, most of my black friends in prison were from the islands. They weren't American blacks, they were islander blacks who had been arrested in the marijuana trade. And anyway, I'm going off into a tangent that has nothing to do with anything. This podcast is kind of a tangent. I just have to wonder, and I'm asking you, to comment and opine, is there a silent black majority of basically decent people who knew something is really fucked up, and would they be open to having an adult discussion with members of the silent white majority and the silent Latino majority and the silent Asian majority? Can mature people have a discussion? One of the advantages, one of the reasons I came up with antipolitism is because when we go to government by selection, not election, and we're selecting a representative group of the population from people who have skin in the game and are working every day, we are going to, by necessity, only scoop up those members of the black, white, Latino, Asian, Jewish, you name it, Vietnamese, whatever. Vietnamese or Asian, I don't know where I went with that. Anyway, they're going to be drafted essentially into public service. And unlike today, where people who get involved in politics fall into two groups, the 98% who are just power mad, and the 2% who are ideologues, that just believe idiocy, like, what's her name? AOC, Andrea Ocasio-Cortez, who might be the biggest moron I've ever seen. And I don't know that I think she might really believe it. I think she's a true believer in this horse shit. But, is that who we really want? Is there nobody living in her district in New York City who is educated and has a brain and works for a living and could be more moderate and reasonable, I dare say that that would be the case. So I guess what I'm really saying in this podcast is, let's throw off the shackles of extremism. That's what politics today is, a practice of extremism, and we must throw it off. And those of us who belong to the silent majority of reasonable, realistic people of all colors and all creeds need to get together and do something different, because if we don't, we're about to flush our country right down the toilet. We're going to throw it all away, and we're going to throw it away. We're going to be crucified on the cross of political correctness. Oh, and that brings me to my last point for today. One more point today, and this is kind of a broad-ranging chat today. I want to talk about Rule 230 and internet security, real briefly. Rule 230 is the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission rule, that defines what was passed by Congress to define internet freedom. In other words, a private, the controversy today where it boils down to is Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, yada, 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 self-police, and they do take down things they find offensive. And people like Donald Trump, this is being spearheaded by Trump, feel that they're unfair, particularly to conservatives that are taking down, they're calling things hate speech that aren't hate speech and so on and so forth, and are getting in the way of conservatism, and therefore they want to change the laws. And again, now we have to talk about trade-offs. Once again, we're talking about solution versus trade-off. Look, I'm on Facebook every day, and I see people get turned off all the time who say inflammatory things right and left. And by and large, they do say, they all act victimized, but they do say things. I mean, for example, and when you say something that's hate speech and it's contextual, and when you deal with a company as huge, for example, as Facebook, with millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of users, it's going to be impossible to accurately police. But the trade-off, if we place into government's hands, okay, and weirdly, this is an issue where both Trump and Pelosi are on the same side of it, and that should be a gigantic warning signal. When the two political parties are agreeing on something, you know that's got to be a bad idea because of the law of unintended consequences. And the unintended consequence, or the trade-off here, is going to be a loss in freedom, a loss of our First Amendment freedoms. Look, I say things that could get censored, and I could get taken down on Facebook, and I understand the risk, but Facebook is a private company. And I'm voluntarily doing business with that private company. And I understand their standards, and I understand what I can and cannot say. And when I violate that, I may have to pay a price, and that is called a consequence. And if I suffer that consequence, I'll have to deal with it one way or the other. And there are alternatives that are springing up to Facebook, and there are conservative alternatives, and there are libertarian alternatives springing up. And a free market will provide it. If people get too dissatisfied with being, for example, edited by Facebook, and by and large, Facebook is pretty mild about it, but if they do, they can always start at something different. Same is true of Twitter, same is true of Instagram. But the minute the government gets involved in the regulation of the internet, of what can and cannot be said, and what is and is not hate speech, and they start trying to convert private enterprises into public utilities, which is essentially what they're suggesting doing, it's a flying fuck up. So I strongly encourage you to oppose any change to net neutrality, even if you're on the right, even if you're a Trump supporter. I know that you guys tend to be blind followers of that guy, but think it through. Think about the trade-off. Think about the unintended consequence. There are always unintended consequences. Okay, that's it. That's really all I have to talk about today. I don't have any sparkling, ideas of what to do other than to stand by the 7 steps I laid out to before, and I guess this was just an appeal to reach out to the silent black majority and the silent white majority to reconstitute our political will under antipolitism and throw these motherfuckers out. And that's it. That's where I'm going to leave it. Okay, so click on the subscribe button, click on the notification button, pick up your free copy of A Radical Reset, or order it in hardcover if you wish for a small charge on Amazon. The links are below. Join the movement. The most important thing is, today we are very, 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 very few. I am not deluded. I am not crazy, but I am also very consistent. And a year from now, there are going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of us. And 2 years from now, there are going to be 1 million of us and more. And it's going to grow. It's going to grow because anti-politism is a great idea. The idea of getting rid of political parties, the idea of getting rid of all money in politics, the idea of getting rid of the pursuit of power, the idea of having a representative Congress that's made up of people like the rest of the country, not 70% lawyers, the blood-sucking paid intellectual prostitutes that they are. It's such a nearly no system is perfect, but it's as close to perfect as a democratic system can be. It's going to catch on. And I need you to be involved. Please become involved. Reach out to me. Let's work together to create the infrastructure that we need to create the movement to save our country. And with that, I'm signing off. This is E.H. Ivins wishing you a great day, a great week ahead, and until next time, be well.